Hello. I wanted to go ahead and start this recording. It's the Friday before a 3-day holiday weekend, so I don't think anybody's able to join today, but I still wanted to record something. If you watched last week's video, we had a conversation about the difference between reaction and responding, and I saw this quote I wanted to share. It's from Simon Sinek, and he says, when we focus on the competition, we become reactive. When we focus on improving ourselves, we become innovative. I thought that was powerful, and I think that's very true for business, in our communities. If you're working in a community, when we're watching the competition, we jump at things too often instead of slowing down and really weighing it. Just because they're doing it does not mean we have to. It might not truly fit where we're wanting to go. So we really need to respond thoughtfully. Um, and some people are like, but that takes too long. But sometimes that's going to save you in the long run. And if you've been doing that, if you know your values, know what you stand for, and you build in where you're used to leaning on those, it becomes easier. It becomes easier to notice and to quickly see, yes, that's something we need to do, or no, that just doesn't fit us, or it doesn't fit us right now. That's something else. Sometimes we jump too soon. Um, Maybe it's just not our season for it, the time for us. So just want to throw that out there. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about today, in in the videos that you've been going through, hopefully in the course, um, there where you we talk about the stories we tell ourselves, right? The stories we tell about our communities, but we don't always consider the nonverbal stories that are passed down that we tell ourselves. Um, and you're like, what are you talking about, Crystal? Okay. So there are attitudes, approaches that sometimes we don't talk about, but our nonverbal cues give them away. And maybe we don't even realize we're doing them. But other people, the next generation, can pick those up. Um, Let me give you a couple examples. Maybe you're risk averse. Maybe your community has been burned in the past, or your business, and you just don't want to take the risk. So you hedge, or you don't put yourself out there, or you just kind of like waffle on things. Maybe you hesitate. So it's not always the things you're saying, but how you're doing them. It's those nonverbal cues. Um, Maybe it's you don't trust outsiders. That's big in the Appalachian uh, culture, but I think it's also a rural thing because in our small towns, we know everybody. And if somebody comes in that nobody knows, we're sometimes skeptical. Um, but that distrust of outsiders can be taught to the next generations without us actually saying the words. So our nonverbal stories we need to pay attention to as well. Sometimes those are passed down through something that's called generational trauma. We talk about generational trauma, or I should say, therapists and social workers and psychologists talk about it in terms of the individual, but our communities are made up of a lot of individuals, right? And there is a thing called collective trauma, where it's the whole group, like the Holocaust, like um, what was done to the Native Americans in some of the boarding schools or in their pushing them to the reservations. Collective trauma, you can also think of it, so if individual trauma is considered, poverty, divorce, loss of a job, um, drug, alcohol abuse. If those are considered individual traumas, think about when a factory shuts down in your small town, what that does to the community as a whole. But we never address that. Let's say there's been, in a small town in Nebraska just this week, in the downtown, 3 buildings burned. That's that's traumatic for that small town. If you look back through the old time papers and when you go through the narrative audit, I gave you a couple ideas of where you can go to find old newspaper articles online. In the one town here locally, it talks about when the cyclone hit, a tornado, and all the damage that was caused. That affects the community as a whole. In the 90s, one of our towns had a significant crime that made national news. It was a horrific crime. Um, that was very traumatic for, I would say, the whole county, not just the little town, that town and that school district, but the whole county because people were on edge for a while. And everybody knows everybody, right? Okay, so generational trauma can be passed down through those nonverbal stories. Okay, let me give you an example. So my grandmother was a teenager in 1931. In February of 1931, her grandfather was first, he was kicked by a cow, broke ribs, had several injuries, as you can imagine. They didn't have pain reliever back then like they do now. So he was in a lot of pain. He ended up hanging himself in the barn. And one of the young grandsons that was living with them at the time, living with the grandparents, I think he was about 4, he went out to see why the barn door was open and found his grandfather. Now, that was a story that was never told to the descendants. When I found out, I found it by stumbling upon his death record. I love to do genealogy. I found his death record. I have copies of his obituary. Grandma never talked about this. She would have been a teenager. She would have known. But then I went looking for in the newspapers and found the story of what happened. They didn't save that part. I've since met other descendants and I said, "Did any of you ever hear this?" Nobody knew. Back then you didn't talk about those things. So it was a very traumatic experience. That was in February of 1931. In the fall, my grandma's only brother, he was a couple years younger, a few years younger than she was, a teenager, he drowned in a farm pond. That was quite a traumatic year. As part of the therapy, I when I was little, my grandmother gave me a quilt. and she had it written out. It was originally pieced in like 1880, and I think I'm the fifth generation to touch it. And but it wasn't actually quilted until 1931. And I thought, and that's when she, her mother, her grandmother, and an aunt, and I think some neighbor ladies, they would get together and they would quilt it. And there was a newspaper article about all of them getting together. I put together 1931. That's how the women were coping. They came together and worked on this quilt together. Um, I knew about the drowning. That was passed down. And grandma never said, um, talked about fear of the water, but that was something, those were those nonverbal cues, that trauma that was passed down. My mother is terrified of water. She will not go near. Um, and so when I was a kid, I absorbed some of that, right? You can sense that fear. When I would be at my grandparents', their neighbor had a pool and they would always invite us, the kid, if the grandkids can come over and swim. Ooh, we were never allowed to do that. But I didn't know why when I was that young, right? I didn't know that until, I don't know, maybe early teens when I found out about the drowning. But that fear, I'm very, what's the word about water? Respectful of water. I don't like getting in where I can't touch the bottom. And some of that fear is passed down. You can sense when somebody is scared of something, right? Fear is passed down. I did see an article. I've been researching this topic for a few years now and how it could relate to communities and how this fear, if a community has faced this collective trauma together and they're not addressing it, they're not breaking that cycle, they're not saying, okay, but and trying to say this happened, but we can still do this. Or and there are some articles. I think I looked up Cleveland Clinic and different trustworthy places that you can read. I encourage you to read about what they suggest how to handle the generational trauma. Because I'm not a therapist, I can just share what I've read and so forth, and how I apply it correctly or incorrectly, but how I'm thinking of it being applied to our communities in our rural areas. One article I read said that up to 5 generations that um, can be affected by something, by a traumatic event. Now, if I think about that and I count back 5 years, I am to the generation in my family that fought in the Civil War, that my great great grandfather was shot in the hips in the war and came home. And I think about, and I'm curious, like, how would that have impacted him? His cousin, on one of the neighboring farms lost part of a leg. His wife's cousin died of, I think, like bad water or something like that, um, in one of the military hospitals. Um, and this was a small farming community in the 1800s. How would that have affected them? And then I think about, okay, what is being passed down? So how did they change, or how did that change their approach to life? And how does that affect my view of community? To me, it shows how resilient they were. And maybe that's why one of the reasons I think about, okay, that didn't work. What can I do? If he was shot in the hips, he came home to farm. That had to have been hard, but he made it work. How did he do that? Very resilient. Our communities, yes, they lost the plant, but they're very resilient. Uh, so are we passing down and focusing on the fear of another plant coming in and leaving, or not trusting the employers? How many times do we get that? They're not loyal to us. We can't trust them. Those types of attitudes, and what we're doing is demonstrating those things. Now, one thing that I don't quite grasp, I guess, with this whole thing, if they say it could be up to 5 generations. So, but then if my mom or my grandma, if my grandma were to go back 5 generations, she would have been at the American Revolution and the Whiskey Rebellion. And where we live, or I live in Eastern Ohio, the Whiskey Rebellion was primarily started over in Washington County, Pennsylvania. And it was the government after the American Revolution had to figure out a way to raise money for the government. So there were all these people making whiskey, so they thought they could tax them. Well, the farmers were not having that. They were making this whiskey, they were resilient as a way to get their crops back east, because back then those crops would go bad, would spoil by the time they went from like western Pennsylvania to the East Coast by horseback. But if they turned it into whiskey, then they had a product that could make it to the markets, and then they could make. And then if the government's coming in and wanting to tax them, they were not happy. Um, so there's that distrust of government and um, that kind of mentality. And I'm thinking, how is that passed down? Fighting for their freedom from England, and a lot of those folks in Washington County, Pennsylvania, moved over to the county where I live now. And I start thinking about that when I learned about this whole thing, and it put stuff into a different perspective for me, because I thought, that's why this attitude or that attitude, it's some of that, um, still that distrust. And like, for example, when during COVID, some of our towns were absolutely adamant. You cannot, the government can't tell us what to do. The government can't tell us to put on masks. The government can't tell us to, do this, that, and the other thing. And then other towns were like, okay, we'll do this, that. And like, what's the difference? We're all in the same county, but it was very different attitudes. And when I started learning about this, then I started getting really curious. I'm like, okay, could that be impacting the attitude? That those nonverbal cues and attitudes are being passed down after these traumas. And so if your family went through like the Whiskey Rebellion and that type of thing, and then moved into our county, that to me was kind of like, that might be why that town, where a lot of their ancestors came from that area, are so adamant. I mean, it's just something to be curious about. And I think it helps us see, okay, it's interesting why we have the attitudes we might have. We may not even realize we're inheriting those attitudes. But then I think we then need to be responsible and conscious of what are the attitudes we're passing to the next generations. And I wrote an article, maybe it's probably been over a year ago now, again, with my love for genealogy and local history. But I wrote the article about am I the ancestor the future generations need? And I think if we approach our business and our community development with that attitude, that might change our approach. Just some things to think about. Um, in rural areas, one other thing that I made a note of that I thought really impacted our small communities, our rural communities, was were the trains leaving. Um, in my area, so many of the small towns were train stops, and they had hotels, which today probably equivalent to like a bed and breakfast type thing, little lodges like that, Airbnbs. But all the little towns then had those. They had a little grocery. They all when the trains went out, all of those things, many of those things left. When interstate then went in 3 miles north of all these little towns, or 1 mile south in the case of some of our participants, that changed the dynamic because then we had the beginning of sprawl, right? Because then businesses wanted to be along the interstate, and sprawl is expensive. So that all impacts our communities, and we don't realize it. And I had no idea until I stumbled upon this concept a few years ago that how much we're affected by that. Um, but if you just think in those if 5 generations from my grandma, let's say, they saw the American Revolution, the Whiskey Rebellion, they saw the War of 1812, they saw the Civil War, World War One, World War Two, Korean War, Vietnam, the Gulf. I mean, they saw a lot of loss, and that gives me a little bit of a pause, and I think a little bit more appreciation for what they endured. Um, I want to assume that they did the best that they could with what they had at that time. And I think if we all approach that, um, that helps. Um, so just some food for thought. Again, research it yourself if you're interested in it. See what you think. I think it could be um, it's a powerful lesson, a powerful tidbit that I'm not hearing it talked about. And I think those nonverbal stories of don't trust outsiders or don't trust the government or all those kinds of things, risk averse, um, loyalty, you can only trust, that maybe that's why our small towns are so tight knit, um, because we rely on each other. It's those nonverbal cues, those nonverbal stories, I think that can be so powerful and might be just as powerful as the verbal stories that we're telling ourselves. So, um, yeah, look that up, see what you think. There's more and more research is coming out about it. And then even when I first started reading and researching it, but I'd be curious to hear what you think about it. And if that impacts and how you can use that to reframe as you move forward and as you choose to be the ancestor the future needs. So, all right. Hope this is at least interesting, gives you food for thought. Take care.